Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a fabulous story tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story, shall we? Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it's happened again, Mum! Cried the anguished voice of 16-year-old Molly, standing in the doorway of her parents' bedroom. The two sleeping bodies of both Molly's mother and father were lying comfortably swathed beneath their luxurious comforter, obliviously unaware of their daughter's urgent voice that was desperately begging them to be comforted. Both of her parents were caught up in the throes of a deep sleep, anchored securely to the world of their dreams, like two boats in their mooring places. They did not awaken to the beleaguered cries of their 16-year-old daughter, whose withered form with wildly frightened eyes seemed all but an ambiguous, blurry silhouette on the horizon of their bedroom, like a round sun peeking mischievously through the dark sky as the dawn slowly begins to break. The aloof-looking digital clock on Mr. Pearson's nightstand flashed a bright red 2:32 in the morning. Its blazing numbers burned into Molly's mind, like the branding on the rump of a steer. Why was it always 2:32? Every time this happened, going back an entire year. Indeed, it was as if the ominous numbers themselves imposed an invisible threat of some kind, and were a catalyst of something symbolic, which Molly could not comprehend, nor did she want to. She pushed the thought away like an annoying leech that might latch onto your body in the Amazon rainforest. She didn't want to think of things like that, or what the meaning of those repetitive numbers on the clock might actually convey. For rambling thoughts like this had the capacity to crawl over your mind like a clinging vine. The Pearsons' benevolent bedroom was bathed in darkness, so that all the elegant furnishings that adorned the familiar space, from the old antique walnut bureau to the plush ottoman with its floral design of pink and white dahlias, to the two-striped Louis XV wing chairs, and the chestnut dressing table with its free-standing wrought-iron ornate mirror, were all swathed in a foggy blanket of obscurity, so that their dense outlines appeared to look like tombstones in a cemetery. The curtains were steadfastly shut, so that not even a trickle of moonlight could filter or trespass through the bedroom, like a gatecrasher at a party that was not welcome to be there. The two beloved family cats, Fudge and Cupcake, were lying at the end of the bed, cuddling up to each other tightly to steal each other's warmth. Molly was freezing cold. Her bare feet clung to the ice-cold wooden floor that never flinched once under her ethereal footfall, for she was as light as a feather. Molly was wearing a flimsy nightdress that did not appreciate the ice-cold conditions of her parents' bedroom, which felt like a large storage refrigerator in a chef's kitchen, even though the dying embers of a fire that had long since grown cold were smouldering away in the hearth of the bedroom's fireplace. The warmth conjured up in the room when the crackling fire was merrily ablaze, many long hours earlier, had long since been forgotten. The icy hands of winter had wrapped its formidable, cruel tentacles around the room, so its coziness had been cruelly expunged. Molly's parents remained steadfastly fast asleep, a slave to their dreams, oblivious to their daughter's cries, for they were both deep sleepers. Molly could see the gentle up and down rhythmic movement of her parents' chests, both rising and falling through the Egyptian cotton sheets that swayed them from beneath the comforter. She could hear the gentle stirring of their sweet breaths. Her parents never snored, but her father did once when his airways had been blocked by a bad case of laryngitis, where his snoring had been so dreadful her mother had actually kicked him out of the main bedroom to sleep in the spare bedroom, describing him as sounding worse than the pot-belly pig George that her family had once owned when she was a little girl, whose snoring could be heard from quite a distance away. The Pearson family owned two beloved, reasonably well-behaved bulldogs that were inclined to laziness, Bella and Barbara, who slept in the downstairs kitchen, as Mrs. Pearson could not cope with snoring of any kind. For indeed those bulldogs could snore the socks off your feet, and the mittens from your hands if you weren't terribly careful." Molly's distraught voice broke through the icy daggers of coldness in the room. This time her voice sounded more like the muted bleat from a lamb than the desperate cry of a teenager. "Mum, it's happening again!" It would seem a mother can always hear the troubled cries of her own child, like a natural inbred protective instinct that can wake you up faster than the cloying cold piercing through the cotton thread of the sheets. And in those moments Molly's mother was quickly cajoled out of her sleep, like a stationary frisbee being flung very suddenly into the air for the dogs to chase, and taking you completely off guard. Mrs. Pearson sat up with a start, looking confused, disorientated and bleary. Her limp straw-coloured hair flattened to one side of her head, her cornflower blue eyes congealed by the silken threads of sleep. Finally her eyes settled on the ambiguous silhouette standing at the end of the bed. At first she gasped in horror, as if she believed she was seeing a ghost, gormlessly just staring at her. Then her eyes sharpened with recognition. The sorry form standing before her, looking so dishevelled like a dying bird the cat had brought in, with its feathers badly awry, was Mrs. Pearson's own daughter, Molly. Mrs. Pearson looked at her daughter's distraught face. Her heart began to do a series of frantic belly flops, as she immediately sensed her daughter's obvious distress. "Molly! Molly, that's you! What's wrong, dear?" Molly began to cry. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She allowed them to flow like clouds that finally offloaded their watery wrath on the earth below. She could taste their saltiness on her tongue. She wiped them away with the sleeve of her nightdress and sniffed. "It's happening again, Mum," she repeated. "She's back. Why has she come back? Why won't she leave me alone? It's like she wants something from me. She scares me, Mum." "You poor thing," said her mother sympathetically. "The main thing, sweetheart, is to remember it's not actually real." "But it feels real, Mum. It feels real." "Of course it does, sweetheart. It's very vivid for you. It feels like it's really happening. But it's not real. Always remember that. If you think like that, it cannot upset you. It only has power over you if you give it power. Remember, when you go to sleep, your mind plays you a movie at night to entertain you. And sometimes those movies can be very scary. Other times they're completely bland." "What's wrong, Jellybean?" asked her father, who was waking up, and peered at his daughter from over the covers. "Your face is as white as a sheet. What on earth happened?" "Our daughter's had another one of her grisly nightmares," said Mrs. Pearson gingerly. "This is the third time in 1 week. It can't go on like this. It's very unsettling to the all of us, and we're all losing sleep over this." Hannah Pearson steadily climbed out of her warm bed, tossing her comforter aside and slipping her feet into her lovely warm fleece-lined slippers on the side of her bed. Her white cotton nightdress skimmed the oakwood floors of their bedroom. She threw her arm around her daughter, enveloping her in an effusive hug. She stroked her daughter's straw-coloured hair away from her face, as if gently brushing away her daughter's anxiety. Molly's hair was not dissimilar to her own, for both mother and daughter looked uncannily alike, almost as if both had been cut out of the same cloth. She looked devotedly into her daughter's blue eyes. "Come and sit down on the bed between me and your father," said Mrs. Pearson, lowering herself down on the mattress next to her husband and patting a space between the two of them for her daughter to sit, so that the young teenager could be pretzeled between the both of them, like the ham in a sandwich. It was oddly reassuring for Molly to be buffeted safely between the two people she loved most in the world, and so she was gently persuaded to sit down. Her pounding heart thundered in her chest like an orchestra of drums, soon began to slow down. "Tell me and your father exactly what happened, dear." "I told you. It's the same horrible nightmare. Everything's the same. The girl reappears at my bed. She looks at me with these haunted eyes, Mum. And when I come to wake you up, it's always 2:32 in the morning. It's as if the numbers themselves mean something." "It's only a dream, sweetheart," said Mr. Pearson, looking at his daughter sympathetically. He was unsettled to see her in such disarray, her hair tossed wildly around her face, her eyes moist with the dew of her tears, that made them seem to sparkle all the more. These frequent invasive intrusions at night were getting far too regular, as his daughter Molly's relentless reoccurring nightmares were beginning to suck the life out of the entire family, and they were all losing valuable sleep from the unfortunate aftermath of these ever-increasing night terrors, which was not remotely healthy for any of them. Mr. Pearson propped himself up against the pillows of his bed. He studied his daughter curiously through his kind hazel eyes, reaching out to squeeze her hands reassuringly. "You know, Jellybean, when I was little I often had nightmares. But how old were you, dear, when this happened?" Mrs. Pearson interjected, looking at her husband with an exasperated expression on her face that suggested he had no idea what he was talking about, as if any nightmare he might have experienced as a child was no match to the nightmares her daughter was experiencing, for it was like comparing apples with pears as far as Mrs. Pearson was concerned. Mr. Pearson thought about this for a moment, rubbing the carpet of stubble that had developed overnight on his chin, like the stout prickles on a baby hedgehog. "I think I must have been about 6 or 7 at the time." Mrs. Pearson smiled knowingly, as if she had expected her husband to say this. "That doesn't surprise me at all. Lots of children have nightmares at that age. It's much more common than you realise, dear. Let me guess, you were scared of a monster lying under your bed. Something like that." "You've got that wrong, dear," said Mr. Pearson, shaking his head vigorously. "Don't dismiss the dreams I had, because I was only little at the time. They were very vivid to me, I'll have you know. I was absolutely terrified. When I was a boy, I dreamed there was an old man standing at the end of my bed, a capriciously belligerent, angry man who was mad at me. He gave me the impression that I was an intruder in my own bedroom, and he wanted me out. Well, honestly, dear, that doesn't compare to the dreadful nightmares that poor Molly here has been experiencing. How can you have the audacity to compare the two? Molly is not 8, she's 16 years old, and she's had dozens of these dreadful nightmares, haven't you, love?" said Mrs. Pearson tenderly, stroking her daughter's hair, with the same adoring sweeping motion she used on the family cats, who still remained stoically comatose at the end of the bed, blindly oblivious to the family discussion taking place. It would seem of late they had become well used to these regular nightly interruptions on Molly's part, that for them had become like background noise. Molly nodded. "I've been having them all the time, Mum. Why won't they go away? I'm so scared. I get too frightened to go to sleep in case she comes back, and she stands on the side of my bed again. It scares me, Mum. She really scares me. Just tell us, dear, what actually happens in the nightmare?" Mrs. Pearson hands her daughter a tissue from the small box on her husband's nightstand. Molly blows her nose and pats the area around her eyes, swollen from her tears. "The dream is actually not set in this house. It's an old house, one I don't recognise. And I'm sleeping in another bed, not the bed I have in my bedroom. I hear the door of this closet creaking open, very slowly. I look up and there is a girl standing at the end of my bed, wearing a white nightdress. The white nightdress is completely covered in blood. The girl is about 7 years old. She's even got blood matted on her hair. She stands at my bed and says, 'Help me,' and walks away. But it's so scary, Mum, so scary, so real." "Of course it's dreadfully scary, sweetheart. No one can blame you for being upset about that. You poor thing. I wish I could take this away from you, sweetheart, but I can't. That's the terrible thing about it, dear, because it's a nightmare. I don't know what to say to comfort you. But the main thing you need to remember is it's not real. If you can get your head around that, it won't be nearly as distressing for you." "But then why does it feel so real, Mum? It's as if the young girl is reaching to me in my dreams, begging me to help her for some reason. But I don't know who she is, and I have no idea how to help her, even if I wanted to." "Of course you don't know who she is, because she doesn't exist, sweetheart. She's a fictitious character your mind has made up. Like a character in a fictional story made up by the writer, but it doesn't exist." "That's not necessarily true," said Mr. Pearson stiffly. "Maybe this little girl does exist, or did exist at one point in time." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" said Mrs. Pearson, looking at her husband. "You're not making any sense at all, dear. You and I well know that dreams are usually symbolic. Sometimes they're trying to tell us something on an unconscious level. But that's all they are, dreams. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't read too much into this." Mr. Pearson steepled his large hands together and said soberly, "You didn't allow me to finish my story about the old man at the end of my bed, did you, love? You were so quick to think he was no big deal. But to an 8-year-old boy, he was terrifying, as the girl in the blood-soaked dress is to Molly." "I thought you said it was a nightmare, love." "Well, I thought it was at the time," said Mr. Pearson. "It turns out it was a lot more complicated than that, if you must know." "What do you mean, complicated?" "Well, when I was little, my parents moved into this 1940s house. Soon after we moved there, I began to have these horrifying dreams that felt so alarmingly, hauntingly real, where this old man was standing at the end of my bed, waving his arms around and getting very angry with me. I was terrified, and on numerous occasions I woke up to find myself lying in a bed stripped of all its linen, as if during the night it had been ripped off me. Suffice to say, during the winter, I'd wake up freezing cold with my sheets lying in puddles on the floor, and I knew that old man had physically pulled them off me during the night." "Don't be ridiculous, love. Oh, honestly, where are you coming from with all of this? You yourself said it was a nightmare. The old man was a character in your nightmare. He wasn't real. There is always a rational explanation for everything as far as I'm concerned. Think about it very carefully for a moment, will you? Maybe you pushed your bed covers off in the middle of the night yourself. Really, Hugh? Where is all this going? You had a nightmare, you tossed the sheets off your body. Big deal. Stranger things have happened to people in the throes of sleep. And some people even walk in their sleep and do the most bizarre, outrageous things. I had a girlfriend once who woke up in the middle of the night to enjoy a bowl of cornflakes and had no memory of ever eating them. But the following morning the kitchen floor was covered in flakes of corn, and there was an empty bowl and spoon in the kitchen sink with the remnants of some cornflakes, and milk. So she knew she'd been eating cornflakes during the night, without even being conscious of it at all." "You're not listening to me, Hannah. I was not throwing my sheets off my body unconsciously while I was asleep, nor have I engaged in sleepwalking of any kind. I was incredibly scared of this capricious old man. He was very real to me, as much as this little girl in the blood-soaked nightdress is to Molly here. One day I saw this old man's photograph in an old newspaper that I found lying in the attic. At the time I was rummaging around in the attic looking for some of my father's old dinky toy collection that he had as a boy. By chance I happened to stumble across a pile of yellowing newspapers, faded by time, but a familiar face peered at me in the newspaper, and it got my attention. I stopped dead in my tracks. My skin actually crawled, because I recognized the old codger as the man that stood at the end of my bed, cantankerously glaring at me. It freaked me the hell out, because I realized that I must have been seeing his ghost. I took the paper down from the attic and went to my bedroom and read it. Let me tell you something for nothing, Hannah. I was trembling in my boots, I was. I was so shaken up. I read the newspaper report. It went something like this. 78-year-old Mr. Philip Croydon of 53 Forestwood Road was found hanging from his closet in the bedroom of the house he shared with his sister Gladys. She had told him he was to leave the house forthwith. She could not stand the bad language he was using when her grandchildren were around. He had a foul, very crude mouth, he had, she told the Tribune. Was always shouting smutty obscenities at my own grandchildren. as they annoyed him greatly, running around the place making a lot of noise. The kids were scared of him, you know. He was always in a very bad mood, a cantankerous bugger he was. I couldn't have him in the house exposing my grandchildren to such lewd vulgarity. So I told him that he needed to leave in the morning. He was aggrieved about this. We argued tirelessly about the matter, but I made my position very clear, and I could not be persuaded to change my mind. Philip told me in no uncertain terms, "This is my house as much as yours. This is where I've always lived. I will leave this place over my dead body." I didn't take him seriously, Gladys told the paper sorrowfully. I'd never believe he'd do something like this. He was very attached to this place, you know, and he didn't want to leave. He knew I was a woman of my word, and in the morning he'd be forced to go, as the property is in my name. The following morning I found him hanging from the closet. I cannot believe he did this. Something so outrageously stupid like this. I'm in total shock, absolutely confounded. But then again, my brother was mulishly stubborn, you know. I guess he meant every word of what he said to me. He refused to leave this house over his dead body. So he left this house in a body bag. It's funny. Even though he's dead, I feel as if he's very much alive. Even my grandchildren refuse to go into his bedroom because they sense him there. And everybody is very sad about what he's done. He's been described by so many of us, so many of my friends, as a likeable old sod who got increasingly tetchy with age. It is true. But I will miss the old bugger. I really will. Even though he was incredibly cantankerous. Ostensibly, when I read that discomposing article, I was flummoxed. I hurriedly ran to my mother, telling her all about my dreadful nightmares and the nightly visitor, the same old man that I'd seen in the newspaper, Mr. Philip Croydon, who had lived in our very house at 53 Forest Road and had slept in my bedroom. My mother was astounded, naturally very disturbed by my startling revelations. She told me she thought I could see through the veil, whatever that meant, because at the time I didn't understand it. She said my great-aunt could do the same. My mother got in touch with my great-aunt Agnes, who was my mother's mother's sister. An interesting old woman she was, with wild white hair, that always reminded me of a dandelion gone to seed. It was all over the place. Not even the hairdresser could toe it into line. It had a mind of its own. She had to keep her hair very short. I'll never forget her piercing blue eyes, that looked like they could literally drill through concrete and see what was buried beneath it. It didn't surprise me to learn she could see into the spiritual realm. And when I told her about the old man, Mr. Croydon, she said to me that next time I saw the old man standing at the end of my bed, that I was to tell him he was to get out, that he had no place being there, and no place throwing me out of my bedroom. He must accept the fact that he was now dead, and that he needed to go to the light. I cannot believe you never thought to tell me any of this, Hugh, said Mrs. Pearson, looking distinctly put out, and a tad stupefied. She had been married to her husband for 17 years, and yet he still had stories up his sleeve that she had never been told about. But then her husband by nature was a privately reserved person, and getting anything out of him was like extracting blood out of a stone. Still, this was an incredulous story that he should have told her about a long time ago, and the fact that he hadn't made her prickle with disappointment. "Did it work, sweetheart?" asked Mrs. Pearson, studying her husband curiously. "Did Mr. Croydon finally leave, after your aunt's advice?" "To hell he did. I never saw the old bugger again. It would seem he was very possessive over my bedroom. But I think when he realized he was dead, he moved towards the light. And I promise you the atmosphere in my bedroom significantly changed. Even my mother commented that my bedroom seemed lighter, as if a heaviness had been lifted. I remember it always used to be cold in my bedroom, but after Mr. Croydon left, it became significantly warmer. It was a different room after that." "Well, I mean, it's ridiculous," said Mrs. Pearson. "Fancy taking your own life because your sister is kicking you out of the house. Who in their right mind does that? Yes, he was greatly aggrieved he had to go. But honestly, he could have resolved his differences with his sister, I'm most sure. If he had minded his P's and Q's, and watched his tongue a little, guarded his words, I'm sure she'd have been happy for him to stay. It seems such a trivial thing to kill yourself over, does it not? Well, you know human beings. We're a complicated species, are we not? Said Mr. Pearson. Some of us are rigidly set in our ways. Maybe Mr. Croydon didn't want to live anywhere else but in his sister's house. He didn't know another life, and didn't want to know another life either. You must remember, love, what floats one man's boat will capsize another man's. My point is that this girl that Molly appears to be seeing in her dreams, wearing a white nightdress soaked in blood, might be more real than you and I know, like the old man in my dream. That makes no sense at all, sweetheart, said Mrs. Pearson. I can understand about your situation, because you lived in an old 1940s house. But we live in a modern Manhattan apartment that was only built 5 years ago. How can it possibly be haunted? That doesn't make any sense at all. Do I look like I'm a sleuth for the dearly departed? Said Mr. Pearson sarcastically. I can't pretend to know how the spirit world works, love. But if Molly here may be being visited by a ghostly apparition, I think she needs to tell the girl in her nightmare that she's dead and should go to the light. Maybe she has a genetic disposition to see things that others don't, much like myself and my great-aunt. What I'm trying to say, love, is that if Molly sees this young girl again, the 7-year-old, however old she is, I think she should tell her what I told Mr. Croydon, and hopefully she'll get the message and move on. You think I'm seeing a ghost? Asked Molly, confounded. But the girl only appears to me in my dreams, not in my physical bedroom. She appears to be in another house, and it's not this one. If I'm seeing her in another house, then she cannot be a ghost, can she? If she was real, I'd see her in my physical bedroom, coming out of my closet, would I not? But I see her coming out of another closet, not the one that I have in my bedroom. Well, I don't suppose it matters where the dream is located, sweetheart. I think what your father is trying to say, Molly dear, is when you're caught up in the throes of your sleep and you're dreaming about this poor little girl covered in blood, what you need to do is step forward in your dream and say, you are no longer alive. You need to leave my dreams. Go to the light. Find your peace. Try and do that, will you? See if it makes a difference. You never know. Do you think it'll work? Asked Molly, looking hopeful. Can you really talk to people in your dreams? Well, you won't know, sweetheart, until you try, my love. But if it worked for your father, who managed to get rid of Philip Croydon for good, I see no reason why it will not work for you. By all means, give it a try, because these nightmares are making the family lose precious sleep, and that is not remotely healthy for any one of us. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.